Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of this podcast where we talk about interesting topics with academic experts. So, today we have Dr. Robin McKenna. He's an expert in epistemology. He's a senior lecturer at Department of Philosophy in University of Liverpool, and he will help us dig deep into topics of epistemology in philosophy, which seems very interesting to me. So, first of all, can you explain us in a simple terms what exactly is epistemology in philosophy?
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So the answer I usually give is that epistemology is two different things. First of all, it tries to answer the question of what knowledge is. So what is knowledge? And second of all, it tries to answer the question of how we can get knowledge. So those two things. What is knowledge? How can we get knowledge? So on the what is knowledge question, here epistemologists want to talk about the difference between knowledge and belief. So you might believe something, that's not the same thing as knowing it. You might really strongly feel that something is true. Again, that's not the same thing as knowing it. You might have faith, very strong faith that something is true. Again, not the same thing as knowing it. So epistemologists want to get clear on what knowledge actually is, given that it's different from belief, faith, and so on. And when it comes to how to get knowledge, epistemologists are interested both in how individual people get knowledge, right? So how can I get knowledge? I can look around this room. I can see some lights, a roof, a door. I can see you, Jay. That's me getting knowledge through my eyes. But you can also get knowledge from other people, right? So I can ask Jay to tell me, I can ask you to tell me about India, wherever you grew up, tell me some facts about it. I can get knowledge from you, even though I've never been to India, I haven't seen the things that you're describing. So epistemologists are also interested in looking into all the different ways in which humans can get knowledge. And that isn't just from looking, that's from testimony and things of that sort.
So, when I was doing some research about you, I got to know that you did masters in math as well as in philosophy in your undergrad. So like epistemology is something which a lot of people, like you explained, also relates with science. It's like we gain knowledge about things, we gain knowledge about what is wood, how human is made up of, its cells. And all these things. So gaining knowledge essentially, if I tend to understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is more like of a scientific approach, is to know things, to understand the process of gaining knowledge, and science could be one of the process of gaining knowledge, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I think is important to recognize is that there's all sorts of ways in which human beings get knowledge about the world, right? So I mentioned the simple one. You look, right? You open your eyes, you're picking up information about your environment, sometimes without even being aware that you're doing it, right? So you walk along the street, you are picking up information about what's happening on the street without even being aware that you're doing it. You automatically recognize that there's a car that is quite close to you, you move over, that's you acting on your knowledge that there's a car there, even though you're not completely aware that you're doing it, right? So that's one kind of way in which we get knowledge. But then, of course, there are the much more elaborate, much more organized enterprises that human beings embark on to get knowledge, and science would be one of those. But not just science, right? So in university, you've got the humanities, fields like history, English, philosophy, for that matter, which are also organized endeavors to try to get certain kinds of knowledge. So in the case of history, of course, what you want is knowledge about the past. So what happened in India, what happened in the UK 100 years ago. And to get that knowledge, you read primary sources and you try to figure out which of the things that are reported in those primary sources are actually true, right? So you might kind of say, well, it's in this book it says that there was a war in this place, a battle in this place 100 years ago. Is that true? You try and find other books that say the same thing. And then history is the systematic enterprise of doing that. And it all gets very complicated. And of course, science is another way of doing that, where you have the different sciences and they deal with different parts of nature. Biology looks at animals, humans included. Chemistry looks at the kind of fundamental chemicals, the things that you get in the periodic table. Physics looks at the even more fundamental things. And yeah, in contemporary science, this is very much a collective enterprise. We've realised that it's kind of hard for one person to know and understand everything. So it's not like Aristotle, where one person could try and reconstruct the whole of the sciences by themselves. No, you've got research teams that do very particular things, right? So this research team is going to bombard this particle with this kind of radiation in order to find out this very, very small thing about how the particle reacts when bombarded with this kind of radiation from this direction at this level of intensity. So a very, very small thing, but you add all that up and you get what we call scientific knowledge. So yeah, the sheer diversity of ways in which human beings try to get knowledge about the world. Epistemologists, I guess, try to impose some order on that diversity.
Lovely, that's brilliant. And going back to your mathematical background, it's sort of interesting because even I come from non-philosophical background and I'm doing my master's in here. I did my physics in my undergrad, and you did math and philosophy both. So what parallels do you kind of draw in terms of skill set or in terms of thinking abilities from math and philosophy, although these two in general tend to have a completely different domains.
Well, actually, I went to university to study physics, but I soon found that labs didn't really agree with me. I wasn't very good at the experimenting part of physics. And I think probably if I could have done like theoretical physics with philosophy, I would have done that. But that just wasn't possible where I was studying. So I ended up doing mathematics and philosophy. Not out of any real love for maths, I guess, just because I was quite good at it. And it seemed like a more sensible career planning decision to do maths and philosophy rather than just philosophy. But yeah, so you asked about similar skill set. I guess I would say that in some ways they're similar and in other ways they're very different. So one way in which they're similar is, of course, that if you want to solve any kind of mathematical problem, you need to think in a very careful, rigorous way, right? So you can't skip steps, you have to sit down, either with pen and paper or I guess nowadays maybe on a computer, and really go through all the details, check your reasoning, make sure there are no gaps. You can't just assume things for no reason. Everything has to follow in a logical fashion. And once you get to the end, if you've done all that right, then you've got the right answer. So it's all about following the algorithm, if you like. So there are these methods for solving problems of this sort, and you have to identify the right method, and then you have to follow that method correctly. And if you do all that, you get the right answer. So of course in philosophy, careful, rigorous, logical thinking is really important. In philosophy, when you're giving an argument, you can't just start saying things are true, you have to back them up. So your reasoning has to kind of have this nice logical form. So one thing that we do when we're teaching is point out when our students are arguing in ways that aren't logical, right? So assuming things without any reason, just jumping in the middle of an argument, the premises have to follow each other in a nice, orderly, logical fashion. But I think also in some ways philosophy is very different to maths, partly because, at least as a student doing a maths degree, you're given these problems that have nice, simple, well-defined solutions, right? Whereas in philosophy, you might be asked to write an essay on what is right and wrong, the nature of morality. You might be asked to write an essay on what it is for something to exist. Or you might be asked to write an essay on a kind of practical ethical question, abortion, right or wrong. There's not a nice simple algorithm that you can use to answer a question like abortion, right or wrong. It's much more complicated than that. It requires you to think about things in a different kind of way. Some kinds of philosophy require you to have knowledge about the world, right? So you want to write about, what is a just society. It's probably a good idea to have some acquaintance with actual societies, whether it's present-day America, present-day India, present-day Britain, whatever, you're not going to write a very interesting piece of philosophy on justice if you don't know anything about what the world is actually like. Whereas mathematical problems are not like that, because you abstract away from actual features of the world and you create this mathematical language, and then you can do wonderful things in that mathematical language. But that's very different from philosophy, where if you abstract away too much, you end up creating castles in the sky that don't mean anything, so to speak.
Right, right. And in philosophy, free speech, free will, free determinism, all these things are one of those catchy terms which a lot of people find it very interesting. And in one of your articles, you've talked about free speech, and I found quite interesting. You talked about Mill and ideal theory. So if you can just let us know in more layman terms what it is exactly.
Maybe I'll start by just kind of explaining what you mean with the reference to Mill and free speech. So John Stuart Mill, English philosopher of the 19th century, has, perhaps well known to your listeners, a very famous argument for the importance of free speech in a kind of democratic society. And I guess maybe it would apply to non-democratic societies, but he's writing in the 19th century in a Britain that sees itself as at least on the way to becoming a fully fledged democracy. So Mill says that it's very important that people be given the right to say what they think, even if you think that what they're saying is wrong, perhaps even if you think what they're saying is dangerous. And he's got a very neat argument for this. He says, well, look, there are two possibilities. Either what they're saying is true, in which case you should definitely listen, because what they're saying is true, and it isn't going to harm you to exchange your old false belief for the new true belief that you get from listening to this person. So clearly, if what someone is saying is controversial but true, you should listen. But what if what they're saying is not just controversial, but also false? Why should you listen to them then? Mill says, well, you should, because in having a debate over this idea we're assuming is false, you are going to get all sorts of other benefits. You'll better understand your own side of the debate because you have to actually put forward arguments for it. That makes you understand your own position better. If there are any truths to what this person is saying, so even though what they're saying is on the whole false, perhaps there are some insights there. You get the benefit of those insights, so you're going to improve your own view. And Mill also thinks that for a society, it's really important to have these kinds of debates, because that's how, as a society, we kind of keep up with our understanding of why we think what we think. What Mill's worried about is a situation where we hold on to certain truths but forget why we believe them. So imagine a world where we still repeat the basics of modern science but have forgotten all of the experiments and theories and so on that back that up. That would be a pretty bad world, right? We'd be saying things that are true, we'd be saying E equals MC squared, but we wouldn't even know what that means, right? That would be a bad situation. So Mill thinks that for these reasons, it's very important that we permit people to say things even when we think that what they're saying isn't true. That's what Mill says in his book on liberty, and this is still cited today as kind of the Bible for defending free speech. So what I want to say in the article you mentioned, but just in other things that I've written, is that when you look at Mill's arguments, it's quite clear that he's making certain assumptions about the kind of society in which you have these discussions and debates. Mm-hmm. And also assumptions about the kinds of conversations that you have in these societies. So first of all, it seems clear Mill's assuming that this person who you're permitting to speak is entering into debate in good faith. They're saying what they think. So Mill's whole idea is that you've got somebody that has a different point of view, there's value in listening to that point of view. That all assumes that the person is telling you what they really think. Mm-hmm. not that they are engaging in bad faith, they're being a troll, something of that sort, right? So it doesn't seem clear that Mill's argument tells us anything about what we should do with somebody who is engaging in debate just to provoke, to cause anger, something of that sort, because they're not telling you what they think. They're just saying things that they think will provoke a reaction in their audience. More generally, if you use what Mill says as a defence of free speech, it seems like that you are assuming that society is a certain way. This is the kind of society in which we can have productive debate and fruitful discussions, from which all these benefits are supposed to follow. So if you think that either in general society is not like that, or that within a kind of generally functioning society there are lots of conversations and situations that are not like that, you're not going to think that Mill's arguments really demonstrate the importance of unrestricted free speech in that society. Because Mill might be right that in certain situations you get these nice benefits from free speech, but if the conditions are not such to produce those benefits, then it doesn't seem clear why anything he says should give you reason for having free speech all over the place. So of course none of that is to say that the arguments aren't valid, none of that is to say that free speech isn't important. It's more a sort of way of complicating the discourse around free speech and saying, well look, you can only appeal to Mill's arguments, you can only use Mill's arguments in defence of free speech if you're satisfied that the kinds of conversations we're having are worth having in the first place. So one kind of resistance to applying free speech all over the place is the thought that sometimes the conversations we're having are not like that. And in those kinds of conversations, perhaps free speech is not quite so important because they're not productive conversations in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But then the question pops in my mind that, conversations, a lot of times some conversations are made for entertainment. Like we see a lot of talk shows on TV where some questions are asked to make a conversation more entertaining rather than more productive. So how do you go on defining the idea of free speech in those situations?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, well, one thing's interesting when you actually look at Mill's arguments on liberty is that he does seem to be talking about the kind of conversation where the whole point is to say things that are true, right? Because his argument, again, is that why should you permit someone to say what they want to say? Either it's true, in which case you obviously should, or it's false, but then still there are benefits from letting them say this thing that is false. But that's all assuming that it's the kind of conversation where you're trying to say things that are true. So a conversation that is just for entertainment, or, I don't know, a conversation with your friend about sport, where you're both arguing for the merits of your favoured team, that's not the kind of conversation where you're trying to say things that are true. You're just having fun with a friend, or it's just an entertainment show. So it's not really obvious that Mill's arguments apply particularly well to those situations in the first place. But the one thing I will say is that I do think it's important with Mill's arguments that they only really work for viewpoints that people actually hold, right? So it doesn't maybe need to be that the person saying something in this kind of talk show situation believes what they're saying, right? Perhaps they don't. But I think it is important that they're giving voice to a view that people actually hold, right? So you might, as a talk show host, have your own political views, but then as a talk show host, it's your job to put forward a different kind of political view to the person you're talking with, and that's totally fine. And that Mill's arguments would apply in that situation. But they wouldn't obviously apply in a situation where someone is just saying things to provoke a reaction, things that they don't believe, and maybe things that no one really believes. Because again, the whole point of that is not to try and explore what is and isn't true. It's just to make people angry. And Mill's arguments just don't seem to be talking about that kind of conversation. So that's another way in which you might say Mill's defence of free speech is limited. It only really applies to situations where people are either saying things that they believe, or they're saying things that they know that other people believe, and they're speaking on behalf of those other people. which
Right.
might be kind of what's going on in a kind of talk show context. But again, then there are the situations where it really is just for fun. But then it doesn't really matter whether what you're saying is true or not, because that's not really the point of the conversation.
Yeah, and going beyond the part of truth, going to the situations of political conversations and political debates, especially we've seen in the we're seeing in the American society a lot of polarization, pro-Trump, anti-Trump kind of polarization in American society, and we also saw the way debates went through before elections in America, the kind of debate we had recently between Trump and and Kamala Harris. We do you think in those kind of situations where the point of conversation is beyond truth, it's more of influence. It's more of how more can you influence people just to be by your side by the for votes, which can then eventually affect a lot of decisions at large. So how do you see the effect of free speech in these kind of situations where conversation is beyond truth?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really want to think about those sorts of debates in free speech terms, to be honest. I mean, all I was meaning to do when talking about Mill was to say that, well, often when people want to defend free speech, they will bring out John Stuart Mill and the arguments on liberty. And I was explaining one of those arguments. And those arguments just don't really say anything about that kind of situation. I mean, a political campaign, the whole point of that is to get more votes than the other side. And within certain limits, you'll kind of say anything that you can that you think will get you those votes. I don't think that you can use John Stuart Mill and the argument I was explaining to say why that's okay, but I don't think you'd want to say that people should be stopped from doing that, right? So,
Right.
I don't think, I'm not somebody who would say that it should be all sorts of restrictions on political speech. But I don't think Mill is really relevant here. He doesn't tell you why that's
Okay.
true. He's interested in something else.
Okay, interesting. Because I got this context from, like, if there won't be an idea of free speech in these kind of situations, then there also possibility of things becoming like China, where the dominating party would then shut everyone off.
Yeah, I mean, again, the point I was just making was that if you want to defend the freedom to have these kinds of discussions, Mill's famous argument in On Liberty is not really much use to you.
Okay.
Because again, a situation where two politicians, Trump and Harris, are having a debate, they're not trying to figure out what's true. They're trying to win an election, right? So Trump will say what he thinks will help him win the election, and Harris will say what she thinks will help win the election. So that means that they're going to say things that they don't believe. They're going to say things that maybe aren't quite true, but they're not trying to figure out what's true and false. They're having this battle where they want to win an election. So it's not about truth. It's not about knowledge. It's just about, it's sort of the way in which entertainment works, right? So you want to have the show that is the most attractive to the greatest number of voters, and that's how you win an election. And that's how contemporary democracies typically work. It's not really about truth, falsity, knowledge, anything like that at all. But Mill's arguments in On Liberty are all about those things. So again, I just think this shows you that people that think that there's some kind of general defence for complete freedom of speech in these kinds of situations On Liberty, they're looking in the wrong place. I think, as you indicate, the way to say that it's important in a democratic society that we have the freedom to have these discussions, however annoying or boring they might be, is to compare it with the alternative, which is an autocratic regime where there are no free elections, where there's just one party, and any kind of democracy is a kind of managed democracy. So that's how you argue for for it being better to have the situation in America than the situation in China. You don't talk about Mill. You just say, if you want a democracy, then you have to have elections, and in a democracy, those elections have to be free. There has to be very minimal barriers in entry. and within certain limits, you shouldn't have candidates threatening to kill each other and so on. People should be able to say more or less what they want to say and let the voters figure out whether they like what the candidates have to say. But Mill isn't really particularly helpful there, I don't think.
Okay, interesting. And what's then your most interesting topic as of now in epistemology in general?
I don't want to choose just one thing that is the most interesting topic in epistemology right now. One thing I'm interested in is issues with the way in which in many Western countries we think about the role of experts in democracies. I think there's a tendency to think that in a democratic society you have to have a really simple division of labour between experts and the public. So as the public, you say to the experts, it's your job to go and do things like cure illnesses, produce drugs, figure out what's going on with the climate, develop new technologies, and we'll just kind of let you do that. And that is fine in all sorts of ways because these experts typically know a lot more about these things than any member of the public does. But there are issues there because sometimes it might be that the experts aren't working on the sorts of things that we want them to work on. So, for example, if in the last few years you've developed long COVID as a result of a COVID infection, you might think that doctors are not paying enough attention or not paying the right kind of attention to long COVID. Perhaps they're not viewing the illness in the right kind of way, and that means that you're not getting the treatment that you need from doctors. So that's the kind of situation where you might think that the public are being let down by the medical profession, and it's important that you exert influence on the medical profession to improve these things. So it's not that I'm interested in kind of challenging this basic distinction between the public and the experts, but you don't want to have a situation where there's a kind of expert class that does their own thing without any oversight from the public, because that's not particularly democratic. That's how you end up with a technocracy, and for various reasons, I think that's not a place where you want to end up. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about because partly as a result of the rise in things like anti-vaccine sentiment, I think some people in philosophy, in other areas of the academy, really want to insist on this strict division between experts and the public, and they want to say that it is not for the public to question experts at all, and that just seems far too simplistic, and it actually can seem downright anti-democratic, because, as I said, it is important to recognise that on all sorts of topics and areas there are experts, but it's also important to recognise that that doesn't mean that experts can do whatever they want, because they might not be doing the things that we as the public want or need them to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like it's also the experts then would have more than required power to just do whatever they like, and then could sort of then again bring a lot of disturbance in power balance.
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, I mentioned a medical example because I'm particularly interested in medical examples. Because medicine's interesting because obviously it requires an awful lot of expertise to figure out the causes of a medical condition, to figure out how to treat it, to develop technologies for treating it, or medications, drugs and so on. That does require all sorts of skills. But it can be that a particular condition is just not being understood in the right kind of way by doctors. So here, patient input is very important because patients have got kind of first-hand experience of what the condition is like. They, in some sense, know a lot more about that than doctors do. And in situations where there's a kind of patient understanding and a medical understanding, and the two don't fit, that's a really important kind of place where you don't want to just give all the power to the doctors, so to speak.
Right.
And this will happen in other areas of the sciences as well. So kind of the way I put it is that, You've got the sciences like physics that don't deal with human beings at all. It's about electrons and things that are smaller than electrons. I don't really think there's much the public can do there, to be honest. We can't operate large particle accelerators. We can't do sort of higher order mathematics, or at least most of us can't. So they are, I think, obviously it's important that physicists don't spend money on silly things, so you need a degree of democratic oversight there when it comes to the allocation of resources, but not really in the actual conduct of physics research. But then you've got all the sciences that interact with human beings, right? So there's the sciences that are about human beings. Medicine, but also the social sciences. Right? The social sciences are about human beings. They're about human societies. So in any situation where humans are the subject matter, it's, I don't think, surprising that you'll have situations where the subject matter, the humans that it's all about, need to have some involvement in the research process. So yeah, that's the way in which I put it. But I'm particularly interested in the medical examples for various reasons.
Interesting. In sciences, even I can see not limiting to physics, because I think physics and engineering is sort of it's sort of big brother, small brother kind of thing. I feel it's because without proper understanding of physics, you cannot engineer new technology, and technology is something where people have a big say in terms of what kind of technology they want to use, what kind of impact does that technology will have on climate per se, in terms of their economy and all those kind of things. And their physics, in physics, let's say the example of quantum computing, that's sort of a good example of understanding how physics and engineering works together, how closely they work together in terms of building a technology that can be revolutionary in future, let's say. So even in those kind of situations, if we do need say of people to see how can it impact to people in general, and also to environment and to economy at large.
Yeah, right. So yeah, but still though, you wouldn't tell an engineer how to build the thing that they're to build. You would tell them whether to build it in the first place, right? So an engineer might want to build something. It's of course important that there are other voices in deciding what gets built and what gets made, but you still, unless you're an engineer yourself, you wouldn't or you shouldn't be telling an engineer how to go about doing their business. So with things like physics, engineering, there's a kind of space where you would not expect non-experts to really get involved, a kind of space where you really need to be an engineer or a physicist to do what needs to be done. Whereas I think with the sciences that deal with humans, it's a lot harder to make that simple distinction, right? So for example, I don't think that non-physicists really have much to say about the correct way to understand electrons. Right, so the correct theory of the electron, the correct definition of the electron, that's really something for physicists to figure out, right?
Yeah.
So as a non-physicist, your opinion isn't really worth anything. But if you're talking about diagnostic criteria for a medical condition, or how to understand a medical condition, that's a bit different, right? So let's take something like chronic fatigue syndrome. You might think that the experience of people that have chronic fatigue syndrome is relevant to how we understand the condition, the diagnostic criteria for it, and so on. This is probably even more obvious in the case of certain mental health conditions. The kind of patient experience of these conditions is relevant to the correct understanding of them in a way that doesn't really... There's no equivalent of that when it comes to the theory of the electron, basically. And that's the basic difference I'm trying to make. But of course you're right that engineers shouldn't get to decide what kinds of technologies we create. So there you do need democratic oversight. But it kind of stops at a certain point.
Yeah.
Whereas with, again, any of the sciences that deal with human beings, things are more complicated.
Yeah, agreed. Looking from an outsider in terms of philosophy in general, there's a lot of resistance from people to pursue philosophy in even academia or even as a career. So being a senior lecturer in one of the prestigious universities on the world, what's your take on how philosophy in general impacts people at large, in terms of, uh, not only in terms of academia but also in terms of skill set, in terms of how that affects a person in general?
Yeah, so what I always tell our students here is that what they get from a philosophy degree is a really valuable set of skills. And what they then do with that set of skills is really up to them. Because obviously, doing a degree in philosophy is not like doing a degree in dentistry or a degree in engineering, where there's a kind of fairly clear career path to follow if you want to follow it. Philosophy is different. But in that respect, it's just like the other humanities subjects, because the kind of idea behind humanities education is that you're not being trained for a particular job. Rather, you are being given a set of skills, you're being given a kind of outlook on life, a way of thinking about the world that, in principle anyway, can be useful no matter what you go on to do. So imagine you come to university, you do your philosophy degree, various things happen afterwards, and you end up being a plumber. But you're a plumber who reads Plato, who thinks about Descartes, who's interested in Nietzsche, whatever. That's enriching your life, right? That's making your life more interesting, because you're doing your plumbing, you're earning money, but you're also thinking about all these interesting ideas, and perhaps that's impacting on how you live your life in all sorts of ways. So what I would say is that philosophy just gives you these really important skills. And kind of go back to what you were saying earlier about increasing polarization, things of that sort. Like, I do think that philosophy is really important here. Not in a way that other humanities subjects aren't, but I think because philosophy is kind of focused on this kind of thing, it's particularly important. Because one thing that philosophy gives you is a recognition that most things are really complicated, right? So in philosophy, there aren't simple, correct answers, right? You can't say what is true and what is false in a kind of easy, straightforward way. I mean, people sometimes say in philosophy there are no right answers. I would say instead that maybe there are some right answers, but it takes a lot of work to figure out what they are. Things aren't simple. Your intuitive, immediate reaction is probably the wrong one. So what you learn from doing philosophy and being confronted with these big questions about free will, right and wrong, and so on, is that it takes work to get to a sensible view of some issue, right? So if you're browsing social media and you see someone that is saying something about some hot political topic, you shouldn't trust your immediate reaction, because your immediate response is probably not going to be particularly reflective. It's not going to represent what you would think if you were to think about things some more. So the kind of advice that philosophy would give you as someone who is browsing social media is to kind of step back, reflect, think, what do I actually think about this complicated issue, rather than just reacting in the moment. And I think that obviously it's quite difficult to make happen, but if people were more reflective, if they were more willing to step back for a second and not immediately get into lots of fights, probably some aspects of polarization as a political problem would be reduced. Because kind of one thing that really stands out to me about a lot of political discourse is just how unreflective it is.
Yeah.
So you've got your set of views and you go out there to defend them. Other people have got their views, they go out to defend their views, you clash, and you end up having arguments where it's not about figuring out what the actual correct view is, it's about winning the argument, it's about beating your opponent. So kind of going back to what we were saying about Mill earlier, right? This is not a way of getting to true beliefs. So what philosophy teaches you is to step back, think more carefully. It doesn't tell you where you're going to end up. It doesn't tell you what to think. But the whole point is that it can't tell you what to think. It's teaching you how to think. What you end up thinking at the end of the day, well, that's a matter for you, not for these philosophical tools.